I'm Josiah McKenzie, and you're listening to Sweet Success.
You've just checked in to Sweet Success. Join me, Katie Klein, for exclusive conversations with hotel executives, hospitality leaders, and industry innovators. Together, we'll uncover the strategies and techniques these masters of hospitality relentlessly refine. Whether you're already in the industry or just starting out, tune in every week to unlock the secret to your sweet success. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Sweet Success. I'm your host, Katie Klein, and today we have a very special guest here with us, Josiah McKenzie. He is the founder of Hospitality Daily, which through its podcast, newsletter, and social channels helps the industry stay informed and inspired. After getting his start in hospitality, working at the front desk of a small property on the California coast, Josiah went on to hold leadership roles at technology companies that serve tens of thousands of hotels around the globe. His experience spans operations, revenue, and investment management, not to mention content creation and entrepreneurship. Josiah, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Katie. I've been looking forward to this. I appreciate you having me on.
Likewise. So, from your perspective, tell us, how did you get started in hospitality?
I'll give you a two-part answer to that. On a personal level, I got started in hospitality traveling a lot as a kid. My mom's from California, my dad's from Canada. We drove back and forth across the country a lot. It wasn't Vancouver, this is Ontario, so we had to drive across most of the US. Did that trip a lot of times. My parents were good at driving through the night, which meant we only got to stay at a Holiday Inn or Best Western every now and then, but when we did, I thought it was so fun. I thought it was so fun to step into kind of another world, get a good sleep, swim in the pool, all the things that you wanna do as a kid in a hotel. So for me, it was always fun to experience hotels as sort of this escape. It's a novel environment, something to step into, and loved it. So on a professional level, also kind of building on a personal experience, I studied abroad in Europe, in Dublin, and had the chance to visit a lot of different places on the weekend. I take those cheap budget airline flights for €5 to a different European city. Often would stay in a hostel. I would only stay in a hostel actually because it's all I had at the point. But found it to be a really cool way to connect with other people. I saw the power of hospitality to bring people together, and these hostels, in this case, being sort of the springboard into the neighborhood, the city that it was in. And I thought it was so cool. So when I got back to the US, I took a part-time job working the front desk of a small property, as you mentioned in the intro, on the California coast, just south of San Francisco. It was an old lighthouse, historic property that was part of the Hosteling International chain. And so there was some of the buildings where the traditional hostel set up, and there was a bunch of cabins that were more these individual suites where people could stay. And I learned so much through that experience and taught me a lot about kind of both the power and the potential of hospitality. I really enjoyed it because on the side I was kind of doing this part-time, and then part-time was building stuff in technology. And I really, really appreciated the chance to welcome people who were visiting the San Francisco area, driving up and down the California coast from all over the world. There'd be people from California, different parts of the US, people from Europe, Asia, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to welcome them, hopefully make them feel comfortable, but also point out some things in the area that I enjoyed and I think they might enjoy as well. So it was so fun and really opened my eyes to the power and the potential of hospitality.
It's interesting how formative your study abroad experience was to you, because I had this exact same experience. I studied abroad in London, and I felt like when I stepped off the plane there, even though I had never been there before, I just got this sense of ease and I felt like I was home. And, however many years later, I ended up moving back there and living there for 6 years. So I just feel like it's such a formative time in our lives. And obviously, a lot of Americans think about studying abroad, and I think, part of the excitement was that the drinking age was lower, but it really can impact our futures and our careers. I mean, your story is a great example of that. And the property that you said you worked at in California, did you say that was like a hybrid of a hostel and then some cabins?
It was officially a hostel, but it
Yeah.
was split because it was operating within an old lighthouse. So it
Mhm.
was a little bit different than all the hostels I would stay at in Europe, which were more one big building and every room was a whole bunch of bunk beds because it was kind of a very small little property. And so it was split into those different things. But I love hostels. I feel like it really has this interesting potential to bring people together. And a lot of the way that many of them are set up around these communal spaces. And so at that property and a lot of hostels, I see more hotels getting into this, but having these common gathering areas is a really nice way to meet people, right? And you kind
Mhm.
of experience some of the things what makes travel fun.
From my time studying abroad, I had the exact opposite experience of hostels. I had horrendous experiences, and I think that whole industry has extremely improved. That was a very long time ago, and, like, the property you're talking about in a lighthouse, I mean, that sounds really special. So, what was your day-to-day there? And that this was when you were still in university, right?
This was after actually. So, this was, yeah, just after, and I day to day there, it's funny, and I imagine many of our listeners will relate, but when you're at a very small property, there's often not a huge distinction of responsibilities. So I think officially I was working the front desk, but
Mhm,
unofficially I was a barista and I was often cleaning the rooms myself and
mhm,
doing all these things because there's often just one or two people on the property. And there's so
mhm.
many different elements to providing hospitality in that context. So I got to see a lot, even though I was sort of hired in one kind of very specific role.
Well, that parlays beautifully because obviously so much of your career then has been in entrepreneurship. And so from that property where you're a kind of a jack of all trades, doing all bits and pieces, I imagine that's quite the same in being an entrepreneur. So what was your first foray into this world of kind of owning your own business?
Yeah, so it started in high school. So in high school, I grew up as a kid in the San Francisco area, and then my family moved to be closer to my parents, or my dad's parents, in high school. And so in that is just a totally different world. Moved from city life to a small country town, one stoplight, 6 hour drive to the nearest airport,
Mhm.
surrounded by farms, and there's just not a ton of jobs in the area that I was interested in. So I was very interested in technology, science and technology kind of growing up as a kid. And I taught myself to code, and mostly because the other jobs at that point were shoveling snow and, working, throwing hay bales, both of which I tried, but are pretty exhausting.
It's amazing.
So,
That's a Hallmark movie
uh,
right there, Josiah.
yeah. And so I taught myself to code, and then from that, I was freelance working on some projects. Then I built some software products, and I found you can create something digitally, software or something else. If you put it out there and people don't come across it, then you're not gonna sell anything in my case, and so I was just these were the very early days of digital advertising on Google Ads and platforms like that, but I used some of the money that I was making shoveling snow and
Mhm.
working on the farm, and then put it into digital ads where you could buy clicks for pennies a click, but I taught myself to run advertising, run digital marketing to promote some of the software I was building, and so this was very small dollar amounts, but it got my kind of toe in the water of creating something, and it was really fun. I had a lot of fun doing that, kind of in high school, throughout college, and then post college, I spent more time starting to get involved in the world of digital advertising, was helping people out with managing their digital advertising campaigns, and so that's how I got started in the world of digital media and publishing and that sort of thing.
It's so impressive because I think most high schoolers are not thinking about how can I teach myself to code and seeing the gaps and then saying, all right, I need to understand digital marketing strategy. And, this was also a long time ago, too. So, very impressive, I would say. I also know that you've been working with social media really since its inception as well. So, how have you seen that change? And now with what you do in the hospitality sector, how do you see social media, digital marketing impacting our industry?
It's been really fun to watch evolve, and I'll never forget when Facebook hit the school I was, going to, and
Mhm.
I think it started out at Harvard, and then it was just a couple other schools, and you had to have a .edu email address,
Mhm.
and I remember guys literally running down the dorm room hall saying, like, "Facebook is here," and everybody in our dorm signing up for Facebook, and it was so funny because it was so small. It was so far from where it is today, but it was very much based on these kind of real world environments, these schools. And then I remember, of course, it expanded from there. But I think kind of a couple things. I think one is I was very interested in digital media and communications, social networks as a way, again, kind of going back to that experience I had in Michigan where I felt very remote and isolated. And I feel like I didn't have access to people talking about some of the things that I was interested in, and digital media provided a way to bridge some of that and open up doors that I didn't have physical access to. And so before I think the rise of mini social networks as we now know them, of course, there were online bulletin boards and discussion forums and things like that. So I saw there's these mechanisms for people to get together and talk about things. I think social media, Facebook originally started with groups of friends talking about things, but I was especially interested in Twitter because that cut across maybe our natural social relationships into helping us find other people that were interested in the same things that we were. And
Yeah.
so I found that to be really interesting in the early days of social media. To your question though of how it's evolved, I think it's moved heavily away from just these networks of people that we know or followers into more of an interest graph, which is simply the algorithms do a better job of showing you content that you want to see, right? And I think TikTok pioneered a lot of that. I feel like every other social network is moving in that direction. The good news is that it used to be that you had to have all these followers to put something out there and for people to connect with it and for that to become useful in connecting
Yeah.
with others. The good news is that anyone, regardless of how many followers they have or don't have, if you create something worth talking about or something really cool, you almost have an equal shot of getting this in front of people. So I think it's really opened up the playing field in terms of communication. I think YouTube is a great example of this, where if you create something, YouTube specifically designs their algorithm to surface some newer creators. And so if you have something worth talking about, then put it up there. And again, same for these other social networks. You almost have a better shot at engaging with people than you did 5 or 10 years ago.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that and I hadn't thought about it that way because when you were talking about when Facebook started, I remember that as well, like waiting for my .edu so that I could have a Facebook. And you're right, it was all about like you'd go out to the bars or at the library or wherever you were meeting people and you'd be like, add me on Facebook. So it was a digital display of our real world life. And if you think of where it is now, the negative side of it was almost, it's so economics driven in terms of adverts and selling and pay to play. But I like that positive spin on it that it's also we have an equal shot and that depending on the platform and the algorithm, we have a chance of being served up more if we have something relevant to say.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing for all of our listeners to keep in mind, regardless of where they find themselves creating or what sort of business they're in, is I think a fallacy that I've got caught up in and throws me off is, whether it is followers, and we're moving a little bit more to a world where it's maybe more about views or likes or impressions or whatever your metric is,
Mhm.
that's sort of a sideshow. It's not really what it's about. I think the real power of social media is more about connecting us with each other, and the quality of those relationships, matter far more than the numbers. And so I think that's something I've had to unlearn because I spent many years as a digital marketer and then as a marketing leader. And I had teams of people that were very focused on these external metrics. But what I have seen evolve, and I'm sure you've seen this, I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to this. It only takes one other person to really change your life in your career, in your business. And so if you kind of move beyond, oh, I need to have hundreds or thousands or millions of fans or whatever your engagement metric is, into thinking about kind of how do I build depth to these relationships? It changes everything that you do, right? You move away from just capturing attention and being provocative for the sake of it, and you move towards trying to share more authentic stories. You move towards being more valuable. And Kevin Kelly's written about this notion of kind of having 1,000 true fans. That's all you need. And he's writing from a perspective of kind of creating things. But I think it's even less. Again, if I think about my own career, it's been one person. It's been a small handful of people that have kind of made these big pivotal changes for me or in the businesses I'm working in or the causes I'm involved in. So I think we're at this point where we need to sort of rethink our relationship with the way that we measure success and outcomes in social media or digital content.
I really like that. And if we also rethink about how things will change in the future, going back to what you said about coding. First of all, do you still do any coding? And second of all, I've heard a lot of speculation around with the advancements in AI that as humans we almost won't need coding anymore. So what's your thoughts on that or your take on that as someone who actually understands a coding language?
I agree. I agree. I think I do not code today.
Okay.
I experiment heavily with AI,
Uh,
and I do agree that we're moving more and more to that world, which I think is good. I think a world where and OpenAI just released Sora, I think it is, and to kind of public use or will shortly, where you can with a couple of prompts you can create these beautiful cinematic images or videos rather. And so you're moving away from a world where you need to know the technical elements of coding as well, or some of these media production things perhaps into a world where I think cultivating a point of view becomes more important. I think understanding what is timelessly human. I think understanding what you can bring to a conversation, how you can make people's lives better. That stuff is worth cultivating as
yeah.
opposed to some of these technical aspects. And I think that's a good evolution. I think that's a really good thing to see because what it will do is it's going to open up the ability for people to create who typically were had these barriers where I need to learn coding or I need to learn some of these other skills. I think we're gonna see a lot of creativity come out of this more AI-driven world, but for it to be done well, it has to be rooted in, I think, an understanding of the human experience, and I think, without that, what you find is the output becomes just a lot of mediocre stuff or just weird stuff. I don't know if you've seen some, like, just really bad AI outputs, and that's just not good for anybody.
No, no. With your experimentation in AI, what are you excited about or what are you thinking, even if it's not specific tools, but kind of the what can the tools do for maybe our industry specifically?
Within the travel and hospitality space, I feel there's a couple things, and I think the only way for our listeners to figure out what's gonna help them is to experiment. There's nothing you and I can say on this that is going to help that much. And I've
Yeah.
just did some experiments over the past couple weeks with my friend Adele Gutman, who used to run sales, marketing, and revenue at a great collection of hotels in New York. And I've learned from her as a mentor for 20 some years about how to think about technology, innovation, doing cool things in hospitality. And so she and I just sat down a week or so ago and we tried to build this bot that would respond to online guest reviews. And I learned a lot through that process because what we found is in just a couple of minutes, we could write better review responses than general managers at these big, huge branded hotels. And it was spitting out really good responses and we could refine that. And I learned a lot through that process. But what I found going into the experiment is I found when people would say that technology or AI will make you more efficient and it can kind of help you do things faster, it sounds trite. It sounds like a buzzword. And honestly, I start to tune out a little bit, right? But when you start to think about here's a specific challenge I have, and Adele and I were building this as just something that both of us had done a lot in our past. And so it was just an experiment. But I encourage our listeners to think about kind of what is something that is taking a lot of my time and
Mhm.
then just block off an hour or 2 and play with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or some other tool and just see what it might look like to make some improvements there. Um, because without that experimentation, what I found having read a lot about this heavily over the past 2 years, but before that as well, is it can all start to kind of sound the same. You need to experiment and make this real by bringing it to your own life, your own work, your own business.
I agree. I think there's been so much fear mongering, particularly in hospitality, around robots taking our job or AI is going to do all the writing and all the writers aren't going to get to do their art anymore. But I like what you're saying. It's less about AI being human because what we've seen is it is really bad at that. It's more about how can it simplify things and take away complexities. And the only way that we understand that is when we're trying and testing and learning ourselves.
I absolutely think so, and I think I mean, to approach this from another angle, a lot of the work that you and I do with, helping people tell their stories. I think that's one vector that this becomes interesting because I'm just looking at my desk here because I have this book that's been recommended to me a number of times, How to Tell a Story, which is a couple chapters
Nice.
in. It's quite good. It's from the Moth, which is storytelling competitions, and just reading the first couple chapters, I really appreciate how it looks at story as being kind of this fundamentally human thing. And one of their principles at all their competitions is it has to be true. It has to be true and it has to be your experience. And if I think about a world where, yes, AI already can and will get even better at telling stories, but what is the perfect story? Like, even if you have this thing that feels very emotional, a lot of the power of a story is hearing another human tell their own lived experience and what
Mhm.
they've learned. Right. And so I think that will permanently be valuable. And I mean, that's just, the work that you and I are doing. But I would encourage our listeners to think about in their area of work, what is the element of this that even if AI could do it perfectly, it's still
Mhm.
going to be better if I do X, Y, and Z, and what is that for them?
Ready to future proof your business? The Future Laboratories consumer foresight and trends intelligence platform, LSN Global, just got smarter. Introducing Ember, a new generative AI tool. Ember transforms LSN Global into your personal foresight research team. Faster, smarter, and more powerful than ever before. LSN Global connects you with the trends, data, and insights shaping tomorrow's business landscape. And now, with AI enhanced research, it's your trusted intelligence partner. Head to lsnglobal.com/membership to book a demo or become a member today and try the beta version of Ember. Research has never been this seamless. I love reading fiction, but I couldn't agree more. I think there's no better stories than when it's true because there's been so many moments within my life that I've been like, "Is this really happening right now?" Whether it's, like, outrageous or funny or just incredible, and it's the fact that it's real and it's happening that makes it so interesting, and if we look back at the very beginning of humans, I mean, we've always been telling stories in our own ways, but I wanna get back to a lot of kind of your early work before we've gotten into Hospitality Daily today. Besides being a snow shoveler, a hay bale thrower, you also worked for venture-backed software companies, and I'm curious, what are some of the key things that you learned during your time there? And I wonder if there's anything that you saw and you thought, "I'm never going to do that," or, "Wow, this is really smart. I need to make sure whatever I do in the future, I never forget this lesson."
Yeah, I it was a really good experience. So it came out of work I was doing. I, kind of talked a little bit about managing advertising and getting involved in digital media and stuff like that. And I started this blog, Hotel Marketing Strategies, talking about how people were marketed as the name sort of suggests. But that led into a conversation. Again, one person can change your life. A conversation with somebody who is building a company in that space. And it's called Review Pro. So essentially the premise was it would go out and aggregate all of the guest feedback, not only from social media sites, but from online reviews like TripAdvisor, and bring it all into one place so you could see what people were saying, you could respond to that, and you could use it to become better. I was one of the first employees there, and I was involved for 7 years, and we eventually sold the company. But I saw through that life cycle, the kind of really interesting things that happen in a venture-backed startup environment. I think in that world, everything's accelerated, right? You typically have a lot more money than a typical business. We didn't in that company, but typically there's a lot more money involved, and there's also much higher growth expectations. And so all of your learning gets very compressed because you're doing so much at a large scale. And for many people, I think working in that environment at some point in their career can be a really good thing because you're exposed to a lot. You can work with some really interesting, high performing people, and you also typically get exposure to trends at scale that is sometimes hard to do in other environments. In that business, by the time I left, we were working in 30,000 hotels around the world. There's no hotel company that's that big, right? And so I got a front row seat into looking at how digital media, how technology was being evaluated and implemented and used in all of these diverse hospitality businesses, and often was in those meetings where all that stuff was taking place and was in the meetings where the technology was being built. and we were deciding, do we go this direction or that direction? And so I had this really interesting global perspective that's really hard to get elsewhere. And I think looking back at it, it's funny, early in the conversation, we talked about entrepreneurship. And I think I grew up in this environment where entrepreneurship was very much celebrated. And so it's almost like the thing that felt inevitable where it's like I need to just kind of figure out a way to do my own thing. And also a lot of the media I was consuming was very focused around that. And that can be good at some point, but it's not necessarily the best thing for everyone. And I think in retrospect, if I had to do it over, I would probably start working for a company earlier in my career because you have an opportunity to learn a lot. And so, anyway, I think that venture backed environment was really interesting. I think something else that comes to mind to your point of what are some takeaways. I think it was interesting to me to notice that in the venture backed businesses that I worked in, really fascinated me was many times the most valuable things that were a part of that business were not what was immediately obvious or immediately or what we were initially going after. So with Review Pro, for example, the premise was pretty simple of collecting all this guest feedback and providing ways to respond to it. But then what emerged over time is that there's what's really valuable here is all of that data in aggregate, right? To see a global perspective on traveler sentiment and
Mhm.
understand what is changing, what are people asking for, what happens when a hotel does X, Y, and Z, what is the financial implications. We did a lot of partnerships working with everyone from or organizations like the research team at Cornell University, where they were looking at the hospitality schools, looking at the relationship between satisfaction and revenue. And we're able to quantify exactly if you improve your reputation by this much, this is where demand goes. We worked with UN World Tourism Organization to understand on a national level around the globe, kind of how can policymakers and tourism professionals think about engaging people successfully. And
Yeah.
so all that to say, like, I think it's very interesting in a venture environment to think about maybe what are some of the things around the periphery of what you're doing that can become valuable. But I think this is true for our listeners, regardless of what business you're in. And I would encourage everyone to think about, is there something that we're doing, or maybe it's a side benefit or a side thing of what we're doing that actually presents a lot of opportunity. Maybe you're a hotel and you have space and maybe it could be flexible and maybe you can start monetizing that in different ways. And so it's really, I think that's one of the takeaways to your question of move beyond the obvious to think about kind of what are some of the non-obvious things that actually could be really, really interesting and valuable.
Yeah, and you almost won't know that until you try, right? Like I was talking to a friend recently and she was telling me she's being mentored by this incredible woman who had this amazing events company and she sold it for millions and millions of dollars. And one of the things that the investors were most excited about was her email list. And I think her email list was about 200,000 names. Now, that's a lot of names. I'm not saying it's not, but that's not like a ridiculous amount of names. And so to hear that for my friend was like, "Oh, that's interesting. Maybe I really need to be thinking about growing my email list as opposed to adding more in the in real life event side of things." So it's interesting what you're saying too about how even at the venture backed level, they'd see that emerge as well.
Yeah, and I think just kind of another thought building on what you shared there is I think it's important for all of our listeners to think about building leverage. So I think for your friend, that email list was something that could be leveraged for something else. And so you're almost kind of creating these assets within the business or within whatever your line of work is that can be useful elsewhere. And earlier we were talking about social media. I think influence, the way that you leverage media can the leverage, I guess, but
Mhm.
leverage is such a powerful concept, and there's so many ways to achieve it. I think in the world of media, it's fascinating because you think about the conversations you have here on Sweet Success. There's so this is going to teach people for years to come, right? And so that's why I'm grateful for you having me on this show. I, imagine people will be listening to this for years and years, and think about kind of what that will do for opening up opportunities for yourself down the road, right? And I think that's something all of our listeners can think about. You know, what does this look like in my world?
Yeah, that's nice to think about. Sometimes I think about how crazy it is that my daughter one day will be able to listen back or watch these back, depending upon what the devices are. It'll be like the way I make fun of my dad right now for popping in VHSs into his VCR, which I can't believe he still has and still works. But you're right. We are creating a bit of a digital footprint. And speaking of, you referenced your blog earlier when you were talking about working at the venture backed companies. In 2007, you started a blog called Hotel Marketing Strategies. And genuinely, my brain thinks 2007 was like 3 years ago, but I can't believe it's almost 20
Same.
years ago now. I feel very old saying that. So, one of the things I'm just so impressed about is like, how did you even start a blog in 2007? There wasn't Squarespace, there wasn't this ease of use and proliferation of the internet. Though it sounds very in line with what you shared earlier about teaching yourself to code when you were in high school. It sounds like you're someone who is very technologically adept and just really excited about figuring things out.
That's kind of you to say that. I do like to figure things out. I also think if you want something badly enough, you'll figure out a way. I don't recall it being exceptionally difficult. There wasn't Squarespace, but I built on WordPress, and I remember that being like an hour most downloading something, and there's step-by-step instructions. And I think anybody can learn how to do something new if you care enough about why you want it, right? So I
Yeah.
guess that maybe comes back to the why, right? Why are you doing that? And for me, I started this blog because I was just interested in the emergence of these social platforms and seeing how sites like Twitter and Facebook and TripAdvisor were starting to influence the way that hospitality companies, which were typically a lot more guarded, and they're like, these are our talking points and this is what the experience is like, then they start to lose all control, right? What happens when anybody can say anything about your hotel or your brand, right? So there's this dynamic happening, and I was personally fascinated by it. And so I was doing this on the side, and I would just interview people that were observing things. I was writing my own observations, and a lot of what was pretty bad in retrospect. But I guess what I took away from that is if you wait for everything to be perfect, right? Nothing will ever get done. It's okay to just move forward with what you do know and kind of follow your curiosity to some extent.
I spoke once with this incredible Irish writer, Niall Williams, and he said that about his books that, like, once they're published and out in the world, they're no longer his. And so, yes, if he went back, he might be like, oh, this isn't as good as I could make it today or whatever. But like that was then, and it was perfect for then. And that was, it was out there. Like you said, at least it's out versus staying in your head and never getting to see the light of day.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Right. And then there's sort of an open, kind of generous approach that you have to take, when we think about sharing anything in that sort of way.
And how was the content on that blog similar or different to what you cover in Hospitality Daily today?
It was a lot more article based and a lot more sort of how to do X, Y, and Z. And so it was heavily built on, I think, the media environment on the time, which strongly rewarded longer form how to type articles. And
Uh-huh.
so driving a lot of traffic through search was a key growth lever. Social media was also a little bit different in that time as well. But Google and kind of people typing in questions to Google and finding my articles was the number one growth lever. So I think I didn't know that when I was starting out. I just kind of started out very randomly, and then through the analytics, I could see that more and more people were finding the site that way. And so I think it was just a little bit of trial and error. That same playbook would not work as well today, and the media environment is always evolving. We talked a little bit about how social media is totally different now, but that was what I saw working back then. And one thing that I did then that I'm thinking about what the parallel can be now is having a mechanism for getting people coming back. And so I
Yeah.
built an email list that was very useful, where if you just find a website one time through Google search, like that's fine, but it's unlikely they're going to come back. And so I really focused on getting people signed up by email and then giving them updates by email. And so I was very focused on building an email engine behind that. Um, Candidly, I haven't seen the same success kind of doing that with Hospitality Daily. I think there are some people that subscribe, but I don't know if it's the media landscape. I am actively kind of figuring out the role of email in, this world today. But, um, but yeah, I think a takeaway for me then that I still think about is how do you engage with people as they want to consume content, but also how they find content,
Mhm.
in that era, and it always evolves. So you always have to be testing and, um, seeing new ways to stay relevant.
You started Hospitality Daily in April of 2022. What is the origin story behind that, and what is Hospitality Daily?
So there's the story I tell, and then there's, like, a little more context, behind the
Yeah,
scenes
let's
that
get
I'll give you.
the
Uh,
juicy stuff.
so the story I tell is a true story, and it's kind of like it goes years back from that date. So it's
Mhm,
an observation I had when I was working at these technology companies. I would visit the offices of all these hotel companies, and oftentimes, if you're working a corporate role, you're in this corporate office, and it was interesting when I was talking to so many people, they wanted to join the world of hospitality because they cared about interacting with people. They loved everything about working in hotels, and then they'd get promoted to this corporate role, and oftentimes, I remember I'd visit the headquarters of these big hotel brands, and it would be these suburban office parks, and it was bad lighting. I think they've gotten a little better now, but bad lighting and cubicles, and it was as far as you can get,
mhm,
from the kind of magic of a great hotel. And so it was interesting because people still cared about that, but I found the day-to-day did not match that, right? And
mhm,
so I always wanted, like, for years and years, I wanted to have a way to somehow reconnect people with that feeling because working in a corporate role is still very important. It enables a lot of the magic at a property level, but I wanted people to reconnect with that. And then on a property level too, this is true in any organization, so it's not just about working in a hotel. But if you're only listening to your leaders or the people on property or within your business, it's just a small fraction of what's out there. And
mhm,
so I saw the power of hospitality, but I wanted people to reconnect with that every day, right? Because every day you have to show up and you have to give. So you have to think about, okay, well, what's going to keep me fired up? What's going to keep my battery full? So this goes back years and years. Like I've always wanted to do that. So in a way, it's been years in the making. I think the other kind of factor there is when I left my last venture backed technology role, I wanted to go into publishing, right? So I wanted to do something in that. Had high conviction and still do that hotel operations is the most impactful element of a hospitality business because if you do it right, you're gonna it shows up as a great culture. You have highly engaged team members, which leads to great service, which leads to happy guests, which leads to more demand for your hotel. And so I think operations is the most important part. So anyway, all that to say, I bought this website, hoteloperations.com. I was going to build this library that was similar to hotel marketing strategies, very focused on operations. And I bought Hospitality Daily at the same time. It was just the domain. There wasn't a business there. I just bought that because I wanted a way to somehow have these conversations daily, but feed into the hotel operations site. But I'm just a one man band. So what happened over time is I was finding a couple things within the world of operations. I was finding that operators also wanted to be inspired across the broader travel and hospitality business, right? They spend
mhm.
all day doing operation stuff. So sometimes they want to read about operations, but sometimes they want to hear about commercial strategy. Sometimes they want to hear about trends. And that's true across anybody in hospitality. So I found through Hospitality Daily, it's a very wide ranging show. It covers a lot of topics, a lot of voices on every level of seniority, every functional area, different parts of the globe. And I found that hospitality leaders really wanted that. So I sort of made this pivot from just focusing on operations into the broader conversations and just followed my curiosity. So that's both the unofficial and the kind of more official origin story of Hospitality Daily.
I'm a huge fan of Substack, and I was so impressed to see that your handle on Substack is at hospitality. I mean, I didn't even think it was possible to get such cool handles still. Did you get that at the same time that you bought the URL?
I did, yeah. I
Right.
signed up for that. I think there's Substack's an amazing platform, and I've since moved to another one for a few reasons, but I think what's been cool to see is with Substack or some of these other tools, it's empowered people with an opportunity to share their
Mhm.
voice. And I've seen a lot of people across the hotel industry, build a Substack or LinkedIn newsletter or something like that. I think it's really cool. I feel like everyone listening to this, everybody working in hospitality should have some outlet where they can share their thoughts. Maybe that's just as a LinkedIn post, but there's more and more tools that are making this possible. And I think it presents a huge opportunity. And I would love to see, more people jump in and start sharing their thoughts.
It makes sense to me that you like Substack, and earlier you said you were really interested in Twitter right away because to me, what I see from you is you are such a natural storyteller. And something I thought that was so interesting that you told me when you and I first met was about your grandmother. So, would you like to share her story of how really Hospitality Daily and the podcast has been in your blood?
Yeah, so my grandmother was a writer, and she had a radio show in the '70s, and which is a little bit before I came on the scene, but she was interested in radio. She still had the show kind of when I was a young kid, but essentially she write these stories about like animals, and there'd be this like character lesson from the animal, and so very different from the world I'm doing. But I thought it was so cool that she would, you know, kind of had the chance to just talk into a microphone, and it would go out all across the airwaves and hit everybody. And I mean, looking back, whether it was her or, I mentioned earlier, my family did so many cross country road trips. We
Mhm,
just listened to a lot of audio. If I think in like
mhm.
retrospect, way more audio than like most of my friends you would listen to would just watch TV or watch movies. Like it's crazy how much radio and, kind of, audiobooks and stuff like that I listen to, and I think that probably shaped kind of the work that I do now where I just love audio. I don't know how to say it another way, but it feels part of my DNA. And then, as I got older, I mentioned living in Michigan for a bit, but I was training for marathons, and so I just have hours and hours running, and I would always be listening to like early podcasts. And for me, it was this amazing way where you could be doing something else. Like we spend so much of our day, on screens or kind of doing work. And so to be able to like get out and exercise and also kind of hear other voices, learn things was always fascinating to me. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny to reflect back on that. And my grandma was the OG, kind of like early podcaster. I'm sure she would have a podcast if she was back in the day.
You guys would have it together, I could see it now, and it's true, like, my daughter is almost 3, and she's a bit TV obsessed. It's something that my husband and I talk about on a daily basis, like, "Are we doing something wrong? This is a problem." Sometimes she'll wake up in the morning, the first thing she'll say is like, "I wanna watch TV," and we're like, "Good morning to you too." And we almost have there are very, of course, positives to it, but we almost have this negative slant on television or on kind of screen time, but we don't feel the same about audio. When I say, "Okay, it's time for dinner," and we're turning the TV off, I have no issue putting music on or something else. So it's interesting that, audio has always been so popular and almost stays in a more positive light too.
Yeah, and I talked with my listeners a lot about this, and it seems like for the people I'm engaging with, and it could be because I started as a podcast, but they have strong preference for listening on audio.
Mhm.
I mean, to be honest with you, people might be listening to this years from now, and I might be proven wrong, but um, I've really kind of been trying to work through that this year because I do see the potential of video in a lot of different levels, and I think it can be really powerful. And maybe I guess my learning is just kind of coming from my own experience, my own set of cards I'm working with. I'm just a one man band, and I have 700 video interviews just sitting in a folder that could be produced. And I think that used to drive me crazy for a long time because there is so much potential with video. But for me, with my current, you know, resources right now, I can only kind of focus into the job that I want to do on audio. So I play around a little bit with video, but I spent a lot of this year trying to be the best YouTuber and play around with all that kind of stuff. And it can kind of drive you crazy. I think if you or I won't say you, if I try to do all that, I found it wasn't working for me. And so I think YouTube is extremely powerful, and I don't think one format is intrinsically better. I think it might come down to what are you personally interested in and what
Yeah.
do you have fun creating. I think, success is interesting because success is just the chance to do, more of what you're doing, right? And so if you don't like what you're doing, success is going to
Right,
drive you crazy.
right.
And so I really love audio. So I don't know. That's what's working for me right now.
Audio is also such an intimate medium. I think, we almost think we need to see people to like get to know them, but actually just hearing their voice and their inflection and listening to conversations, it does feel really personal. And if you think about what's possible in television and in movies, you're right. You almost need so much more time, money, effort to produce a video that is captivating and to the viewer's expectation than you do with audio. You just need the topic and the kind of speakers to be of interest to the person who's listening.
Yeah, yeah. I think I think you're 100% right, and I think that's kind of why I'm focused on this. But I will say I do appreciate your show on YouTube because I think, we talked a little bit about story earlier and how it being fundamentally human. And yes, probably AI will create avatars of ourselves where we can talk, but we can tell the difference. You can tell the difference, and I think so there is a powerful role for video. So I appreciate you being on YouTube. I think I appreciate people who do it, and just for me, it's not something I'm focused on right now.
Well, that is all thanks to my producer. So big shout out to Kelsey Tran right now. But having run Hospitality Daily now for 2 plus years, yeah, two, nearly 3 years, do you have any predictions for the future of hospitality?
I always find it more interesting to kind of look beneath the hot takes to kind of figure out what's going on in the culture, what's going on in the world that might help us be relevant. And so I think with regards to the future, I think I try to spend less time trend spotting and more time identifying problems, either that I experience myself or I'm hearing from my guests, where
Mhm,
it's like, this is a recurring issue. And so an example of that is I I feel like more and more of our world is digital. And so I find for myself having a chance to disconnect from that becomes really interesting. And so I'm very interested in nature-based hospitality. I think among investors, there was this big push, kind of during COVID and post-COVID into a lot of these glamping, outdoor-based hospitality. Some people are saying, "Oh, is this still going to be have as much potential?" I think it will. I think there's a lot of durability there um, that maybe some might be overlooking. And I had the chance to there's this brand called Wild Haven here in California. I had the chance to go to Yosemite a couple weeks ago and spend a few nights there, and it really brought me to a good place. I think I was, like, not sleeping enough. I was kind of, pretty all over the place, and just going there and, going into the little tent and sitting on the back porch and looking up at the stars, it's very centering. I don't see that going away, so I think that is always gonna be very important. Um, I think we talked a little bit about AI before. I think the jury's still out on what that will look like, and I think it's honestly probably gonna look different for everybody, so I would encourage people to just do some experiments yourself. It's less interesting to look at kind of a headline like, "AI is gonna change the world," and it's more interesting to think about, "AI is gonna save me this much of my workday."
right.
Um, I do think technology is remains very interesting for me and for the people I speak with, and I believe that there's gonna be a new wave of small lifestyle brands or collections of hotels that are driven. There's a lot of big forces that are coming together. I think there's emerging opportunities for financing that
Mhm,
didn't exist before, where more people can put in smaller amounts of money, which could lead to opportunities for more focused sort of niche concepts.
mhm,
I think the media landscape is becoming more democratized. Consumer preferences have become more specific. So if you take all those factors together, I could see a new wave of lifestyle hospitality brands emerging. And then among existing hospitality businesses, I think technology presents so much opportunity. The areas that are top of mind for me the most are around sort of workflows and managing teams. I find the most sophisticated hotel operators I speak with are laser focused on that. And it could be because a lot of hotel owners are finding their costs are going up so much. And so if you can really, in practical ways, come up with using technology to serve people more efficiently and also just kind of do your job more efficiently regardless of where you're at in the hotel. So there's some companies that are doing interesting things in that area I see as really interesting. I see opportunity for tools that will collect more data and make these organizations ready to benefit from a more AI driven world, right?
mhm.
A lot of this benefits of AI depend on you having your data in the right place. And so I
Mhm.
almost see there's this precursor to benefiting from AI that I imagine we're gonna see more and more interesting solutions in that. And then once that's there, AI has such a really interesting opportunity to proactively predict and present recommendations for doing work better, right? And I think we're just scratching the surface of that. So it's something I'm really interested in. Will be fascinated to see how that involves or how that plays out in the year ahead.
Yeah, very exciting indeed. And now I have the final 3 questions for you that I ask everyone. So first is, what was the best hospitality experience you've ever had?
Oh man, so I there's this group called Palisades Hospitality here in Northern California, and I had two really good experiences with two of their properties that are sort of tied for first. One was at the Madrona, which is up in Healdsburg. It's this small little property that they did amazing design and just end to end. It's a really fantastic experience. You just arrive and you feel like you can exhale, and everyone's gonna take care of you. Felt really incredible. And then more recently, I stayed at the Alima House, which is at Point Reyes, which is just north of San Francisco. And same kind of feeling. I feel like there is a generosity in their hospitality and also a rootedness in the place that they operate that feels very special. I think a lot of people talk about that, but I find many people pursue that, but not a lot of people can actually deliver on it. And they do it really well. So it feels really good staying there.
And on the opposite side of what sounds like 2 incredible experiences, what was the worst hospitality experience you've ever had?
That's a hard one. I wish I had a real horror story. I feel because I've worked so long in the world of online reviews, it's interesting because online reviews do give you a pretty good sense of what
Mhm.
it will be. And so I haven't really stayed at a place where like this is absolutely horrific. I think what ends up happening a lot of times is it feels highly inauthentic in some
Yeah.
cases
Mhm.
where they're trying to be a certain thing and it feels weird when you stay there. So it's less about like the room's terribly dirty or there's this massive lapse in service. It's almost if you're a little bit off and inauthentic in a way, it just doesn't feel right. And so those are the ones that like really rub me wrong.
Yeah. And this final question is really fun to ask of the founder of Hospitality Daily. But what does hospitality mean to you? And is there anyone, it could be a brand, it could be a person that you feel like has truly mastered it?
Mm. So hospitality is it kind of comes back to some feelings of like I can exhale, I'm
Mhm.
safe. There's this baseline of needs being taken care of. I find often it's very generous. Some of the hotels that I stay at, even if I'm paying a lot of money for that room, if there's things included or I can charge my car or there's cookies or there's things that don't cost a lot of money, but it just feels a little bit like I'm not nickel and dimed here, which really removes that feeling. And then if you kind of move up Maslow's hierarchy, I think to the highest level being kind of transformation, which is a tall ask, but I think it's hospitality presents this opportunity to be your best self. I think organizations that do that really well. I mentioned Palisades. I think they have a really interesting approach to that, largely because they empower their teams to think about what that looks like in their context. I think on a large company perspective, Accor is interesting because they're doing a lot of things around innovative business models and things like that. But I like focusing on people, and I know that was part of the question there. So I think that, man, there's so many people. I'm thinking of Bashar Wali, who I've spoken with a number of times, and has this. He talks a lot about that feeling of hospitality where even if you provide over the top amenities or services, it can feel inauthentic and it can feel like not great hospitality. So there's a sort of a leading with your heart that needs to take place. And as a leader, you need to think about empowering others that can do that. And I found that's become increasingly important as more and more people try to move into lifestyle hospitality.
Josiah, thank you so much for being here today.
This was a lot of fun, Katie. Thanks for having me on.
All right, everyone, it's time for today's sweet summary where I break down the key insights and actionable takeaways from today's conversation. I find Josiah to be such an impressive and down to earth entrepreneur. He's constantly looking to deliver value and to serve his listeners, his readers, his colleagues, and his friends, all the markers of true hospitality. He spoke about how growing up, there were times he felt remote and isolated, as if he didn't have access to the people who were talking about the things that he too was interested in. And that it was in his discovery of digital media that he was able to bridge that gap, opening doors that he didn't have physical access to. I find it fascinating that he mentioned how becoming an entrepreneur was celebrated in his family and felt almost inevitable for him. Now, maybe this is my psych minor talking, but combine that with his grandmother's role as the host of a radio program in the 1970s, and it really makes me stop and think how much our childhood environment affects the adults we all become. Whether it was chosen or predestined, there is no arguing that Josiah is a talented entrepreneur. Two of my favorite pieces of advice that he shared are: you can create something wonderful, but if nobody knows about it, it's not going to sell. And that when we create something worth talking about, we now have an equal shot of getting it in front of the right consumers thanks to updates with social algorithms. While I view him as a real expert in technology, it was interesting how much time we spent talking about humanness. He spoke about the importance of connection, of building quality relationships over quantity, and ensuring depth to those as well. When speaking about AI, he suggested we all think about the things that are timelessly human, how it's more important than ever to cultivate a point of view, and that it only takes one person, just one, to change your life. And finally, Josiah said something that I couldn't agree with more. If you want something badly enough, you'll figure out a way. Now, as a recovering perfectionist myself, I struggle less with the doing and more with the what comes next. Lucky for me, Josiah had an answer for that too. If you wait for everything to be perfect, nothing will ever get done. And that concludes another episode of Sweet Success. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, and review the show. We all know how important those 5-star reviews are. I also want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in. It means the absolute world to me. And I'd love to hear from you. If you have ideas for future guests, new topics to cover, or even just want to say hi, don't be shy. Message me through our website, sweetsuccesspodcast.com, or on social media at Sweet Success Podcast. That's sweet like hotel suite. Once again, I'm your host, Katie Klein, and I'm super excited to see you all next week.